Today is October 25, 2017, and it is being October 25th, Davidian History Day. So before we begin, let's ask our Heavenly Family for a blessing. Heavenly Family, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to review some of our history and to learn lessons from the past. Please guide us to really grasp those lessons and to learn more about our past history that perhaps we haven't known or has been unclear. In any case, please guide us in this meeting. Thank you so much. We ask this b'shem tzemach, in the name of Branch. Amen.
Yeah.
Okay, so if anyone else has come on during the prayer, welcome. And it's Davidian History Day. And I thought we would start with just asking if anyone has any questions about Davidian history. And of course, that is not restricted to Victor Hough's lifetime. It is from Victor Hough's lifetime up until today, and branch history is a huge part of Davidian history. So does anyone have any questions in regard to any of this?
I have one question. Why was there a break in the Living Spirit of Prophecy between Ellen White and Victor Houth of about that 15 years?
Okay, good question. Why was there a break? I can't say I know exactly why. It might just be that our Heavenly Family couldn't find anyone during that time, or perhaps it's just that no one was really ready for it because, you know, there was an active move when Ellen White died in terms of changing the understanding within the Seventh-day Adventist Church of what the Spirit of Prophecy is. So, you know, beyond that, I can't really say exactly why that would be the case.
Thank you.
Sure, no problem. Any other questions?
Trent, okay, sorry, I missed that last part you said in the introduction. You said it's not only restricted to Victor Hough's days, but did you say it comes down to our day?
Yes, definitely. Are you there?
Yep, I heard you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm just thinking of, I'm sure I have questions. I just, it's not coming right now, but yeah, I think
Sure.
I've had questions before, but just give a little time, maybe it'll pop up.
Sure, and I'm interested too, like if no one else has any questions like right there on your mind at the moment, I'm wondering if anyone would like to do a brief review of Davidian history, and you know, you could just mention what you view as some significant points in this history, and maybe that will end up bringing about further discussion or questions or what have you.
Thinking.
So should I take that as no one wants to give a summary?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just so rusty on that right now.
Okay, sure. in that case, maybe we'll look a little bit. Well, let me ask: does anyone here want to do, like, Teresa, Mom? Does either of you guys want to do a brief summary? And, like, are there some significant points of Davidian history that you can think of?
Well, I think that if anyone just kind of goes back to the beginning and thinks it through out loud, that all of us can come up with something to say. So you have Victor Hoddeth, who in 1929 started getting divine revelation on the Sabbath school lesson that was being taught at that time. And that was when divine revelation began again after, like Mary brought out, being quiescent for some time after Ellen White's death. And during Victor Hoddeth's time, you saw a lot of advancement in organization. You have a very significant split because of the rejection of the message by the Adventist leadership, forcing this new governmental structure to provide protection for its members from being forced into combatant service, unless they can show religious reasons for holding non-combatant status. The government would have forced them to bear arms. So the Davidian movement was organized and protected its members that way. You have the progression of revelation, the understanding of the kingdom came about. The main point, of course, in the beginning was trying to bring about that reformatory movement that would bring about the 144,000. And then as truth progressed, as revelation increased, as it naturally does, it doesn't just stay stagnant. There's one point and now you just feed off of that one piece of food for the next 30 years. We understand that every new moon, every year, every cycle, you have continual revelation for whatever circumstances we face at that time. So as truth progressed and understanding progressed, then Victor Hoddeth was showing revelation about the premillennial kingdom. Not everything to do with it, of course, but important points. Prior to that, the Adventists were teaching that there were only 144,000 living saints going to be around at the second coming, and Victor Hoddeth showed that no, there's going to be a lot more than that. Interestingly, the tables are now turned, and that's, a little sidetrack. So anyway, there's a lot more that could be said about how things went during the days of Victor Hoddeth, but in essence, it just became highly organized. There was a lot of work being done. Well, that brought about, of course, the attacks of the enemy to try to put a stop to that, and so far he's done a pretty good job, over time at least. So Victor Hoddeth died in 1955. That's a significant event. And about 3 months later, you have, that was when, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that was when Ben Roden wrote the 7 letters to Florence Hoddeth, about 3 months after Victor Hoddeth's death, or no?
Well, not exactly. 3 months after Victor Hoddeth's death is when Ben Roden was called and accepted his calling.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So there's prophecy about that, too, about the harvest period and how, during a hard rain, you can't harvest the grain because it has to be dried first. So there was a drying period and then time to harvest the grain. Anyway, Ben Roden came along and revealed the truths about the feast days. Not in its fullness, of course. We're still learning about the significance of the antitypical observance of the feast days, but started the observance of the feast days, and over time, throughout the branch history, that has continued to progress. So That was 1955, and then a lot of significant things happened during Ben Roden's ministry. So much that obviously I'm not going to go into it all, but there was significant trips to Israel. One of the big things that I find very significant is the fact that he was the first believer in Jesus as the Messiah to purchase land, to what I'm trying to say is he got it set up for 150,000, right? Immigrants to come and settle in Israel. And that's a pretty significant thing for a believer in Jesus. And if there's something else related to that I'm forgetting, feel free to mention it.
Well, it's just that prior to the branch being able to send members to Israel, and some of them moved there and everything, like it was the first kind of religious community of believers in Jesus to settle in the land of Israel since its establishment as a nation in 1948.
Mm-hmm.
And, to hold worship services and all of that, worshiping Jesus in the land of Israel.
And that's really huge.
Yeah.
Ironically, the Seventh-day Adventist Church took credit for that and claimed that he was a Seventh-day Adventist, forgetting to mention that they had basically
kicked him out.
Exactly. But anyway, so he had also met with President Jimmy Carter to discuss the possibility of funding the building project for another temple in Israel. He and George, his son, met with Jimmy Carter on that. But then shortly after that, Ben Roden died, so that never really went anywhere. Don't know what would have happened if he hadn't died, but it definitely just fizzled out after his death. But prior to his death, his wife Lois Roden started to receive revelation about the femininity of the Holy Spirit, and she first started considering that, or getting her mind agitated on that subject. How many? 4 years prior to his death, something like that.
When Lois started.
Yeah, she didn't bring it out, like they didn't teach it yet, but
right. It was in 1973 that she first started to get an inkling of that subject.
Right.
But then in 1977, a year before Ben Roden died, is when she started teaching it.
Right. So when she started teaching it, then Ben, looked into it as well and came to the same understanding that it's truth. And then for the next year, the last year of his life, they taught the female Holy Spirit together. And they only knew about the mother at that time. So for 7 years they taught the mother only? Mm-hmm. And then started to bring out the revelation of the divine daughter as well. So the 4 members of the Godhead. But there were a lot of things that Lois had to deal with. She started the Shekinah magazine, which reached out to a worldwide audience, as I understand, on the femininity of the Holy Spirit. And she included a lot of information from various scholars. She was actually quite connected to the scholarly world, and scholars would reach out to her. They would learn that someone was teaching the female Holy Spirit, and they would reach out and say, hey, you're right, here's some information on that, different things like that. So, of course, there's a lot that could be said about things that happened with Vernon Howell during the branch history as well. We have studies that have gone through that in much more detail. I'm not really going to go into that. But just simply to say that Vernon Howell, who later changed his name to David Koresh, was definitely used by the devil to blacken the name of the branch. And people today typically think that David Koresh was in some way the instigator of the branch Davidian Seventh-day Adventists, and that's not true, of course. The branch movement has been around since 1955, decades before Vernon Howell came along. And then, of course, Doug received more revelation since the days of Lois Roden. Lois Roden died in, what was it? When did Lois Roden die?
Lois died in 1986.
1986, okay. So from then on, Doug Mitchell was the next messenger, and by then things had really fallen apart. Vernon Howell did a lot of damage to the branch movement. And Doug basically had his entire duration of his ministry as an inspired messenger by himself, pretty much. He had a little bit of help here and there along the way, but nothing significant for any long period of time. Not that the help was insignificant. All help is significant, but it didn't last for that long, relatively speaking, at least. So anyway, he brought out more in relation to the understanding of the daily, the Lord's Supper, and how it's a real meal, and different aspects regarding that. He brought out a lot to do with the dry bones experience of Ezekiel 37 and the need to have a resurrection to spiritual life. And he passed away in 2013, March 2013. And I'm just thinking back to when Doug was alive, but sick with cancer. And, yeah, he knew that if he died, that there would be another messenger, no problem. So that was quite an amazing transition in my experience. I'd only been a believer in the branch message for about a year, and but knowing that we're told that there will never be another dry spell, so to speak. There will never be in the branch movement another quiescent period without a living prophet. I also knew that there was going to be someone. We had a very small group. I knew it had to be a believer in Doug's message. It had to be someone actively involved in the message. And so at that time, our Heavenly Family moved in quite amazing ways to reveal to more than one individual in our group who they had called to be the next messenger. So here we are. There's a lot more that could be said, so if anyone else wants to add, maybe me talking has rung a few bells.
Mm-hmm.
It has.
Awesome.
Hey, I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, what about, I thought when Ben Roden started, he wrote something. If it wasn't those 7 letters, what did he write? What was he writing?
So the first thing that Ben Roden wrote was the 7 letters to Florence Houteff, but those were not written until, starting in the fall. He didn't write all 7 letters at once or anything like that. So, the very first thing, let me just get the actual date of it. Yeah, the first letter to Florence Houteff was on September 23. So, that's the first time he sent something to her. But he started receiving revelation before that, back in May. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess so. You say that he started it in 3 months, but he only sent it in September or something like that, right?
I don't even know if he wrote the letter earlier than that, but he started to receive revelations in May.
Okay. Because I'm just going by the story that I heard is that he was told, that was the first thing he was told to do, he was told to write, right?
That's true, but that doesn't mean that that was the experience that happened in May. In other words, he could have been receiving revelations and all of that prior to that time before actually being convicted that he needed to actually communicate it. So the idea is that he, prior to actually writing the letter, was, understanding various elements of the message, and then basically when the time came, then he was pulled up from his pajama tops and told, write the letter. And so he did. And then at the end, he said, how can I sign this? This isn't really my own idea. And then he was told to sign it Branch, or the Branch. So with, I think it's the sort of thing, like when you read the first letter to Florence Hoddiffe, it's evident that certain elements of the message had already been unfolding since, between Victor Hodiffe's death and the writing of that letter. And so, since he specified May as being the time, then, May would be the time that he started to receive light. Kind of like how Victor Hodiff started to receive revelations in 1929, but never actually published anything until 1930.
All right. Mm-hmm.
I have a question too.
Sure.
Okay, Trent, when Doug was alive, remember he was talking about some land. I can't remember if it was near Waco but it was, I could describe it as something where he attempted some legal way to acquire it or to investigate if it belonged to the branch. Do you remember? Do you kind of know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, there was some land that the branch owned in Colorado, and I don't know all the details as to how that land originally became part of, branch property and different things like that. But when everything happened in 1993, and then there was all this confusion in the aftermath of the siege as to, well, who does this land belong to? And, of course, Doug was involved in that, trying to say, hey, actually, it belongs to the Branch Davidians, and Vernon Howell and those with him were never actually really representing it when they acquired the land in 1987 in the whole ordeal with George Roden. But then, there were several other issues involved in that, and Charles Pace joined with the followers of David Koresh. So there were, what before were, more sides to the coin, as it were, became reduced when Charles Pace joined them. And then Doug ran out of money to be able to continue on with all this court stuff and all of that. And so yeah, he wasn't able to successfully acquire the land in Texas. But I think it was in 2006. I don't know all the details of this, but he went to try and acquire the land in Colorado because that wasn't included in the confusion in Texas. And so he thought that it would, be more likely to be able to acquire that first. But I don't know all the details of how that happened. I think the same issue there was that he didn't have, in order to take the legal route that would have to be taken, he had to have an attorney and it would cost however much, and he just didn't have it. So, yeah, it didn't end up being able to happen, which is why I think even now, if you look on the old branch website, the-branch.org, I think on the homepage, there's somewhere like at the very bottom or something like that, or in one of the side columns, Doug wrote a couple sentences explaining how, we are in kind of like in need of help in regard to legal matters for property and the identity of the association, and if anyone knows of a way to help us, please let us know. Something along those lines. So I don't know the present state of things, like with that property there, like if it just became a tax sales property and someone else owns it now or what. I really don't know.
Okay, thank you. That's excellent to know.
Yeah, an interesting kind of obscure bit of Davidian history for sure.
I have another question if nobody else does. It's all coming.
Go for
it. Okay, is it safe to say when talking to Davidians, is it safe to say when describing how the branch would slide in there after Victor Houteff, normally I would say something like, after Victor Houteff died, right, Florence Houteff took over, of course, as the vice president to keep, the association organized still, right, so out of chaos kind of thing. And eventually, is it safe to say that she claimed to be inspired eventually when she predicted the 42-month prophecy? And also, is it safe to say that Ben Roden was the only one claiming inspiration during that time? And that in hindsight now, we know that Florence Houteff was not inspired. And so is it safe to say that where there's a false, you'll find a true? And if Ben Roden was the only one claiming inspiration back then, so the contenders is only Florence and him, therefore, there's where you point to, or there's where the arrow points to, is to Ben Roden. What do you say to that kind of statement when you're talking to a Davidian?
Okay, so I've been asked similar questions before, and so basically the mere existence of a false prophet at a given time does not mean that there is automatically a true prophet at that exact same time. So prior to Ellen White being called as a prophet, there were multiple false prophets that were on the scene. And if someone thought that, well, if there's a false prophet, that means there must be a true one right now, and then they had to find, someone immediately, then they would just look at the options and say, okay, I'm going with the best one that I can find, when in fact at that time they were all false prophets. So it's not like the idea of where there is a false there is a true is true, but it's not so exacting that it's literally moment by moment the case throughout the history of the world. There are times where there are false prophets without true prophets. As to Florence Houteff, I don't know precisely the nature of her claims. In offering an interpretation of Scripture like that, especially as a Davidian, she was inadvertently claiming inspiration, but I don't know if she actually overtly made the claim. Like if she thought of herself as inspired, or if she thought of herself as a prophet. I don't know if that's the case, and I don't know if other Davidians viewed her like that, or if she said anything to indicate that that's what she thought herself to be. So I wouldn't make the claim that she claimed to be a prophet unless there was actually evidence that she did make that claim, or claimed to be some sort of inspired teacher or something like that. Obviously, she thought she was right, or at least she claimed to be right, and I don't think she would say that she wasn't moved by the Holy Spirit to make the prediction that she did. But again, like I know in one meeting minutes, one record, one document that we have, the idea of kind of like, her authority and who is she to call even a meeting of the executive council when the Leviticus states that only the president can call a meeting of the executive council. And she kind of said, well, someone's got to do it. Someone, Victor Hoddif's dead now, and, when it comes time for us to, look here in Joel 2, and we're supposed to sanctify a fast and call a solemn assembly. Well, someone's got to do it. And so, that's it.
Reminds me of Saul.
Yeah, exactly. Not waiting on God. Just, well, someone's got to do the sacrifice. I'll do it. Sorry, what was that?
What did Jesus say?
She said that it reminds her of Saul.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it reminds her of Saul because he didn't wait for Samuel. He just thought, well, someone has to do the sacrificing, so I'll do it. So it is a very similar thing to what Florence Hoddiff did. So, yeah, that's I guess, I think that those were really the main elements of your question. Was there anything else?
No, you covered it.
Okay, excellent. Anyone else with questions or comments in regard to the review that Teresa gave, or anything else relating to Davidian history?
Yeah, I do. It's interesting how when talking to the average Davidian, they don't really expect there to be another prophet except for after Brother Hoddif. But it's interesting to know that he came into the church in a time when the church had actually recently given up that belief, and that's affecting everybody right up till today.
Yeah, excellent observation and comment. Yeah, I mean, sad thing how it's, the Adventist church gave up the understanding of the living spirit of prophecy prior to the advent of the shepherd's rod message. And then Davidians spent 25 years really trying to emphasize and say to some of the Adventists, like, hey guys, no, look, the living spirit of prophecy. And, if you read the first part of the End of Davidian Quiescence, wherein I collected a lot of Victor Hoddif's statements on that subject, it's just so plain that this is what the shepherd's rod was teaching. And yeah, so it's pretty sad that after that, Davidians reverted to the Adventist position. And I don't know if I'll be able to find it real quick, but I know I've read it several times in the meeting minutes of the Executive Council led by Florence Hoddiff shortly after Victor Hoddif's death, where it was mentioned, like, hey, the people are expecting there to be another prophet. What do you say, Florence? So it shows that Davidians did understand at least at first, what Victor Houteff was teaching, and then it was after the death of Victor Houteff where that change of understanding took place.
You know, that actually is similar to what happened after Sister White died, right?
Yeah, very much so.
Okay, so the truth about the living spirit of prophecy was lost after Victor Houteff died is because no one heard Ben's voice, right, calling out, and eventually all these other usurpers came along which did not advocate that truth anymore, right? Is that why?
Well, I mean, when Ben Roden came along, it was really, when basically his message was rejected by the leadership in Davidia, in other words, Florence Houteff's council, because it basically rebuked them. And so it was rejected, and then from the top, so to speak, the Davidian leaders, they started to speak against the idea of more prophets, and they started to say that Victor Houteff was the last, and we are not supposed to have more prophets, and all of that. And so a lot of Davidians accepted that idea because it was being promoted from the leadership. And really, I mean, every Davidian association has kind of followed in those footsteps to varying degrees. Like, that's why basically almost all of Davidia buys into the idea that there are no more prophets. So, M.J. Bingham, for a short time, accepted the branch message, and it seems to be that he, continued on the idea that the living spirit of prophecy is supposed to be active in some way. And then in the early 1960s, he developed the Bashanite theology, the few unique interpretations of the rod message that constitute the Bashan understanding. And that's really the only Davidian organization, or at least it was really the only Davidian organization for a very long time, that even said that there are to be more prophets, in a sense, after Victor Houteff. But really, though, Bashan didn't even say that at first. At first, Bashan wasn't saying more prophets. It was saying that the living spirit of prophecy is not just manifest through a prophet. It used to be manifest through a prophet, but now it's manifest through the porter, and then later that developed to the idea of the porter prophet. But yeah, I mean, in bulk, Davidia has rejected the idea of more prophets after Victor Houteff, and that direction really started in the days of Florence Houteff because of the rejection of Ben Roden and kind of explaining away the need for more prophets by trying to say that Victor Houteff was the last.
Great, thanks.
Now, I'll just mention something as an interesting side note. I've been kind of skimming through some of the minutes of the Executive Council after the death of Victor Houteff as we've been talking here, just to see if I could find that reference. And I haven't found it so far, but I have found one here that is kind of interesting. And unfortunately for this particular meeting minute, I don't have the top portion of it, so I don't know precisely the day. The one before it is from May 4, 1955. And one of the things that this one says that is kind of interesting is that basically they acknowledge that they did not have the living spirit of prophecy any longer. So I'll just read the paragraph. It says, in a conversation with Fred Campbell, Brother Custer reported that Fred said that the council members were puppets and are also liars, that since we no longer have the living spirit of prophecy in our midst, everything we do and even our best intentions will be wrong. Now, that's interesting because many Davidians today try to say, oh no, we do have the living spirit of prophecy in our midst, because, you know, we can have no successful revival and reformation without the living spirit of prophecy in our midst. So many, you know, Davidians today will acknowledge the need for the living spirit of prophecy, but will just interpret the idea of the living spirit of prophecy to mean something other than having a prophet in the midst. But this shows that, you know, there was the understanding right after Victor Houteff died that they no longer had the living spirit of prophecy in the midst, which clearly shows that, you know, they understood that in order to have the living spirit of prophecy, you have to have a living prophet. So this is before that major change in theology that led us to where we are today. Another thing, actually, published by Florence Houteff in the Symbolic Code in Volume 11, Number 1, page 14. This is in November of 1955. It says, "Since we now know through prophecy that the latter rain has temporarily stopped, let us not waste our time with strange voices and winds of doctrine, but rather let us make available to others the very present truth, which now has mighty power to give life or death." Now, they were kind of using the idea that the latter rain stopped to say that there's no more fresh message coming right now. But yet, they're talking about presenting present truth. And everything else that was coming, they would just say, oh, that's just strange voices and winds of doctrine. But it's interesting that they recognized, you know, most Davidians today would say, oh yeah, the latter rain's pouring because we have the rod message and it's pouring through the literature. Well, Davidians just after Victor Houteff died understood that the latter rain had stopped. Even though they still had the literature, even though they were still publishing it, you know, it shows that in these earlier days they understood what the living spirit of prophecy was and that they no longer had it in their midst. So I'll kind of keep skimming through this while we're talking just in case I come across this statement regarding, you know, expecting a prophet. And if I don't, perhaps I'll come across something else. In the meantime, does anyone else have any other comments or questions?
I do. Okay. Question number, 4 for me? So Doug's message, right, Revelation 14:18, and another angel came out from the altar, which had power over fire, and cried with a loud cry to him that had the sharp sickle, saying, Thrust in thy sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. So Doug's message is, okay, so it's crying with a loud cry to him that had the sharp sickle. And we know that a sickle is a harvest instrument, right? And it's telling the person with a sharp sickle to thrust in the sharp sickle, basically to harvest now, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth. So we're talking about grapes, right? Because for her grapes are fully ripe. So when I read that, I think of, okay, that's now your message, Trent, right? And so Revelation 14:19 says, and the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth and gathered the vine of the earth. So basically, what I'm just trying to ask is, so this message is now going to be able to be equipped to bring in the grape harvest, right? And are we getting there? Like, are we touching on that, phase yet, do you think?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In order to really understand the answer, I need to point out that Revelation 14, as it has been fulfilled so far, is really only in regard to an intellectual harvest. Being harvested, being sealed are relatively the same thing. And Ellen White talks about sealing as settling into the truth both intellectually and spiritually. Now, if you go back to Revelation 14 verses 14 to 16, there's a harvest of grain, and it's, hey, the harvest is ripe. Well, the first thing to be harvested is the barley. The fulfillment of those verses in terms of producing the people represented by the grain, first, of course, being the wave sheaf, the fulfillment in regard to the ingathering of people and the production of the wave sheaf is yet future. And so in that case, we're still back before Revelation 14:16 in regard to that level of fulfillment. What has taken place so far is the fulfillment only in regard to the harvest of truth, which is intellectually preparing the people to become the people groups specified in the verses as being the product of the harvest of grain in verses 14 to 16, and then the harvest of grapes in verses 17 to 19. So basically what that means, just to give an example of it in order for us to understand it better, is that when Ben Roden's message came in fulfillment of Revelation 14:16, it was a return of the message represented in Revelation 14:14, which was the 1888 message. And what that message did was to reap the harvest of truth, that message being Ben Roden's message. What Ben Roden's message did was to reap the harvest of truth, which was nearly harvested by the 1888 message, but was not. It's not that Ben Roden's message produced the wave sheaf, the people group supposed to be harvested, or which is supposed to be harvested. It just brought in the truth. So that's the only sense in which these verses have been fulfilled so far. In that respect, we have been harvesting the grapes ever since the beginning of this phase of the message. Now, what that means is that the teachings of Lois Roden and the message which she bore, represented by the angel with the sharp sickle in Revelation 14:17, brought many aspects of truth which were just barely hinted on, but not really brought in, not really harvested. Now, those aspects of truth are what this message is really reaping. She quoted from the Apocrypha a few times. And now that was interesting, but she didn't really go into that. This message is abundantly reaping the harvest of truth, just barely touched on by those few instances where Lois quoted the Apocrypha and talked about the Apocrypha. And then, we didn't even know this until recently, but she actually recommended for people to read the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that there might be some stuff there that is worth our while. And she said that John the Baptist was an Essene. Now that's really interesting. There's that one statement that we have from her on an occasion in an audio study. And there's one place in her literature, it might be in the Behold Thy Mother series, where she quotes from someone, and they said Dead Sea Scrolls in the quote, and she put Dead Sea Scrolls in all caps. So there's the only slightest amount of hint in that direction, and this message is again abundantly reaping the harvest of truth hinted at by those couple little things in Lois's message. Lois talked about justification by faith. She talked about the need to be born again. But again, only to the branches at Mount Carmel Center, and it's just in a few studies that we have on audio cassette. So it was just really being hinted at. This message is abundantly reaping that harvest of truth hinted at by her message. So, there's a lot like that. Now, the grapes are, it's a symbol of life, a symbol of the blood of Christ, and here in this message, we are understanding the truth of sacrifice, what Jesus' death is all about, how to obtain the new life of Christ's righteousness. So really, and by the way, it's for all Israel. It's the message of truth. It's being put forward in a way that makes it possible for all Israel to be flooded with life-giving righteousness. And I mentioned that because that's what the grape harvest produces. In Revelation 14, I forget, in King James it says how many furlongs there are. I don't remember the exact number, but it is basically the span of the land of Israel from north to south, and that's the idea. That's the importance of it, that it's showing that this is covering all the land of Israel. Well, this message is definitely geared to be able to reach all who would be Israelites indeed. So in regard to the intellectual harvest, it's already been happening, but I think it is important to remember and recognize that the manifestation of the fulfillment of these verses in terms of people groups being produced is something yet future, but it only makes sense that the truths which are going to produce those peoples will come before those peoples are produced. So that's why we've had this intellectual harvest and fulfillment of these verses in regard to a harvesting of truth prior to the harvest of people.
Okay, interesting. I'm gaining more and more knowledge of this Revelation 14 after this this call.
Awesome. Any other comments or questions?
Okay, one more. Is it safe to say that the branch with Ben Roden was the first message or group of people that initially brought in the feasts, or the antitype of the feasts? Sorry.
Okay, well, those are two different elements, and I'm glad that you mentioned both because that's hugely significant.
Yeah.
Now, do you mean worldwide, or do you mean within Adventism, or what?
Let's say worldwide for now. Yeah.
Okay, sure. So so far, like there's a lot in the world, so I can't give an answer to exclusively, to kind of say, like, it was only these people and no others. But I will say that I know of at least 2 groups that started to keep festivals, and these are people who believed in Jesus, prior to the branch movement. One of them was an early Black Hebrew Israelite group, and I think it was like in like the 1910s or something like that, like maybe like 1914 or sometime around then. I forget the guy's name, but I remember doing some research into the origins of Black Hebrew Israelitism, and yeah, there's some guy and a group of followers that he had, and they at least kept Passover. I'm not sure if they kept the other feasts or not. I can't say, but I'm pretty sure they started keeping Passover in like the real early 1900s. And then there's the Church of God. I think it was the Church of God with Herbert Armstrong. And if I'm getting some of the details wrong, like the people's names or the names of the churches or something like that, then I apologize. If anyone knows better, you can correct me. But there was, I think it was the Church of God and Herbert W. Armstrong. So they started advocating feast-keeping at some point, and it may have been before the branch. I'm not entirely sure. Like, I wasn't able to find exact dates, but it may have been as early as the 1930s that they started keeping some of the feasts. So those are the 2 which I'm familiar with. And it's possible that there might be others. Like, I can't say for sure, but those are the ones that I'm familiar with. But in regard, like, you added that other element of anti-type. Now that's a whole nother ball game. And when we're talking about keeping the feast in anti-type, then yes, the first is the branch. Without a question on that. There wasn't an understanding among the other groups of the anti-typical priesthood and what it means to keep the feasts in anti-type or anything like that. So, that's, in order to really have that, you have to have the understanding that Adventism provides regarding the heavenly sanctuary and Jesus' ministration in the heavenly sanctuary and the antitypical Day of Atonement and so on and so forth, seeing how the various rituals that were part of the Levitical priesthood point forward to not only events, but also actions within another system. So, yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, so does anyone else have questions or comments in regard to Davidian history? Okay, so I'm not hearing anything. So what I'd like to do before closing this off is recap a couple things from the past year. And the reason why I kind of want to do this is because if you look at how Davidian History Day was looked at and what they did in the days of Victor Houteff, it seems to be that one of the points of emphasis was to kind of review the past year, because they understood that we are making history as we go. We are making history, and so what has happened in this past year is already history. And if time should last, future generations will look back at these events and recognize them as significant points in history. So I kind of want to do that a little bit here, and we won't give a report of different things that have happened necessarily in terms of sharing the message here and sharing the message there and people coming into the message. That's one of the things that was done on Davidian History Day in the days of Victor Houteff. And I will mention, in case anyone is interested in reading it, you can read the Symbolic Code of Volume 10, Number 2. This is the last symbolic code in the days of Victor Houteff. And it's about History Day at Mount Carmel. And they called it the beginning of days, they called it History Day, they called it the Day of Days. And they reviewed what had gone on in that year since the previous Davidian History Day. So it'll be interesting for us to consider our own history in this past year. So what I'm doing right now is actually just looking at the titles for the studies that we've had since the last Davidian History Day. So on one of our computers here, we have all of our studies in iTunes, and so I can easily just look over the titles, and we can kind of think about what we have learned in this past year, where the message has gone, what we have come to. And maybe as individuals you can think of this, like, what did I not know? What way of thinking did I not have that I now have? What things have I learned that I had not learned a year ago? So the very first study that we had after Davidian History Day 2016 was a case study in knowing. And this was part of the Virgin Birth series of studies. But a case study in knowing was a particularly good study because we really emphasized the principles involved in how to know, what to know, and belief and knowledge and different things like that. And the study after that is called How to Discover, and it's along the same sort of lines. So I recommend for people to listen to those studies. They are on the YouTube channel, the Seven Angels Messages YouTube channel, so you can go and check that out. But those were the very first studies that we had at that time. After that, we had the studies on sacred song, and then we had an intermingling of studies wrapping up our virgin birth investigations, and then also talking about inspiration. And we had that whole series on inspiration. We had 6 studies dealing with inspiration, the nature of it, how it works, and how to apply the various principles of inspiration to other things. So that, I think, was a very important series of studies to have. And I think that many people here have had a change in understanding as a result of those studies. And then we had the lost songs of David that we discussed. We talked about Hanukkah, of course, reading Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews. And, of course, we'll be coming up on Hanukkah again in not too long. It's still a ways away, but I updated the times on the website today if you guys want to check it out. I put the significant days on which we will be having meetings for the rest of this sacred calendar year, so up until the 12th month. So anyway, we had Hanukkah studies, reading from Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, and that's always interesting, gaining more understanding of history leading up to the days of Jesus. And then there's more studies that we had dealing with different principles, error lost, truth retained, knowledge gained. That's dealing with learning and unlearning, and unlearning and unlearning. Q&A on theism and morality. We've learned more about what morality is really about and its basis in particular. That's something we've definitely discussed this year. The shaking, the historicity of Jesus' crucifixion. That's certainly an important study. And in the future, I definitely want to have more studies or YouTube videos or something along those lines talking about how we can know certain things and what can be known. So I mentioned on a call quite some time ago, maybe even a year ago, that for at least 7 of the letters in the New Testament claimed to be written by Paul, we can actually know and verify that Paul actually did write them, and it helps establish for us a chronology of Paul's ministry and what was going on at that time. Now, this is really important because we can verify that right there in the 50s of the first century that Paul was teaching, that he was active, that he was writing his letters, that he was talking about Jesus, that he knew Peter, that he knew James. We can actually verify all of this, and that is so important for really verifying that Jesus existed, that, you know, what he taught, who he was, what he was all about. These are things that we do not have to, quote unquote, take on faith, as it were. There is plenty of sufficient evidence in order to demonstrate the truth of these things. So, yeah, the historicity of Jesus' crucifixion is certainly important. We've spent a lot of time studying the community rule. That took up a lot of our studies. Of course, in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we actually went through the story of the Exodus according to the 3 Pentateuchal sources which cover that issue in a story format. So that was a really fun series of studies that we had, reading through J, E, P, and not D on the Exodus story. And I hope in the Feast of Unleavened Bread next year to kind of discuss some of these issues more, and also the question of the historicity of the Exodus. So we can look forward to that. And in the community rule studies, I think we also learned a lot in regard to the 2 ways, and then in our more recent studies on the community rule, learning how to find out what the truth of a manuscript is. Textual criticism, paleography, etc., all of those fun things that we've been learning. Let's see, yes, we had studies on the shaking also. That was a very important study.
Trent, is this just starting January 2017 are you talking about, or are you talking about the case study in knowing? What date was that? Do you have that?
Yeah, this is October 28, 2016. We are recapping everything from the 2016 Davidian History Day.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Yeah, so, right, there's another study that we have called Should I Believe What I Don't Know? that kind of addresses some of these principles. Another one is methodology causing the shaking, and so on. Okay, so following all of these community rule studies that we've been having, I mean, we really focused on that a lot. And then one of the other things, of course, that we've been discussing has to do with logical fallacies and reason, logic, etc. Those are some of the most important things that we have discussed. Science-based medicine, science-based everything. And I think that kind of recaps some of the major things over the year. Of course, the new moon studies have various other elements, and I haven't mentioned all of those, but we went through the beginning of the words of wisdom embedded in First Enoch. That was another interesting thing. We've had a lot of confirmation of elements of the message that we've already been studying. And then, of course, the most recent new moon, just a couple days ago now, opens things up quite a lot more. And I'm sure that we haven't felt the true impact of that yet. But really, I think it's important to keep in mind that up till now, in this message, in all of its phases, from the days of Ellen White and before, up until now, we have really been focused exclusively on Israelite literature. And everything else, all of the other literature, we have, it would be the automatic thing to just view it as, oh, well, that's just pagan literature from other cultures and so on. So why would that be important for us? But what we're realizing now is that that's not really the right way to view it. A lot of the literature that we have from these other cultures comes from the pre-Israelite world, the time before there even were Israelites. And even within the Israelite literature, it speaks of there being a line of faithful, truth-observant people prior to the Israelites. And so we really do have to put this other literature on the table and ask whether any of it contains divinely inspired messages from the pre-Israelite era. And I think that may change how we view many things. So anyway, that's the recap for kind of some of the things that we've learned. If anyone has anything to add to that, feel free, or if anyone has any questions, now's the time to ask. All right, well, since I'm not hearing any comments or questions, we can wrap up the meeting. Would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I will. Heavenly Family, I thank you for this past year, all the new light that you've given us, and all the teaching and guidance that you've given us. I thank you for even our history as Seventh-day Adventists and Davidians and Branch Davidians, and I thank you for this time that we can set apart to learn about our history. And Ellen White, of course, talks about how important it is to know how you've led us in the past and your teachings in the past. And so we do thank you for this time to just be cognizant of that, and so we don't make the same mistakes that Israel made and that everybody else has made, and that we are so prone and susceptible to making ourselves. So strengthen us and encourage us, sister. We thank you. Your hand of blessing and strength upon all of us. In the name of the branching and sheet. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right. Love you all. Have a good night.